Space, a final frontier.
Hello, Trekkie Dave here. So today I am wanting to do some book reviews. Okay. So basically, I'm going to do a bunch of book reviews, multiple ones, and they're basically my favorite books of all time, and the reason why I like them. And the reason why I'm doing this, again, it's sort of like the top 50 films of all time. I'm hoping that my boys read a lot of these books, and also that maybe it's something that you guys are interested in, and just observations I have on these books, why I like them, and so forth. Okay, so let me begin. So the number one book I'm going to start with, which I seem to start with every time, not the book, but Star Trek. So the number one that I'm going to start with today is this book, Star Trek, the motion picture. This was written by Gene Roddenberry in 1979. I've read this book 3 times and I love it. And the reason why I love it is it's the only book he ever wrote, and it's his vision of the future. It's pure Roddenberry. So it's so good that way. Okay, so it's an amazing book that way. It's pure Roddenberry. And sorry, I lost my train of thought there. Imagine that. So hold on. It was my mom's favorite book. So she read it multiple times. And because of that, because of it being Roddenberry's vision. So one of the things I want to address today with this book is whether this book defines the film. And what I mean by that is Roddenberry wrote this story for the movie. And there's actually 3 versions of this movie. There's the original theatrical cut, which is basically this book. The theatrical cut is Roddenberry's vision. Then you had the television special that was basically Roddenberry's version, the theatrical cut, and it was also Robert Wise who was the director, and it had his version. So it was longer, okay? And then the third version of this movie is the director's cut, which is pure Robert Wise, okay? So what is the definitive version? Well, if we go off of the book, in my opinion, the definitive version of this movie is the Roddenberry version. It's the theatrical cut. And what the differences between the versions is the theatrical cut is pure Roddenberry to its core. It's pure Star Trek. And the Robert Wise vision has a bunch of added character moments. And I think those probably came during the shoot because Robert Wise had a history of doing that, of putting in character moments. And they're not central to the themes or to the story. But they're like pure character moments. And what I think happened is he inserted those in there. So you've got the Roddenberry version and then you've got the Robert Wise version. And I like the character moments. I think they're great. But for me, I prefer the Roddenberry version. It's more concise, it's more to the point. It covers off the themes of the film, and it doesn't go off on character tangents. So for me, when I watch the film, I watch it with the theatrical, which I think is the definitive. And then if I want more character moments, I'll watch the director's cut. Okay, if that makes sense. And I enjoy both. But to me, the theatrical cut, the 1979 theatrical cut I saw in the movie theater is the definitive Star Trek the motion picture. It is the better movie across the board. The Robert Wise version does have more character moments, which Star Trek was a big part of, but I just think the theatrical cut is better, in my opinion. So for me, it always goes back to the theatrical cut, and that is literally this version, okay? written by Gene Roddenberry. Okay, so the next book that I want to cover off, and I'll just quickly tell the story behind this because it's kind of funny. So back when I was a child and Star Trek had been canceled off of television, there was a delay of about 5 years before they released any books. And when they did release the books, they released, I think it was like 4 of them. And for Christmas one year, my mom had gotten me one of the books, which is called The Galactic Whirlpool. Okay, and it was in my stocking one Christmas. This is still my favorite Star Trek book. And I got this as a child, probably a 10-year-old child. I don't know what year it was, but it was in my stocking. And I still love this book today. It's like a 178-page book. It's a small book, but I still think it's one of the best Star Trek books ever. Well, it's my favorite Star Trek book. And it was written by a gentleman named David Gerard. And what's interesting about him is he was the youngest writer to sell a Star Trek script to Gene Roddenberry for the original series for the episode Trouble with Tribbles. And Roddenberry loved the script so much, the Tribbles, that he bought the script from, I think he was like an 18-year-old kid. And then a decade later, after Star Trek was off the air, he wrote this novel, okay? And I just love this novel. And I got it for Christmas, and like I said, what's kind of interesting about it, I remember going to school with this novel, and there was a kid at school named Brad, who is kind of he was a kid that I didn't know liked Star Trek. And one of the funny stories about him is he I thought this was so funny, but he came to school one day, and he had a raccoon's tail, and it turned out that he had actually cut it off of roadkill, that the raccoon had been hit by a car, and he had a kid's pocket knife, and he cut off the tail. So he's kind of a scary kind of a kid, which was sort of funny. And I remember my friend Paul, who I met in kindergarten, was so weirded out by this, like kind of understandably, but I mean, we're kids, right? But what I remember so well about Brad was I pulled this book out of my knapsack at lunch. So back then you'd have lunch at 12 o'clock, and then lunch would end at about 12:10, and you could go outside. And I pulled this book out, and he's like, "What's that?" And I'm like, "Oh, it's a Star Trek book. I got it for Christmas." And he looked at it, and he's like, "That is so cool. I didn't know they made Star Trek books." And he looked at the book, and he read it over the lunch break or whatever, and he gave it back to me, and he's like, "That is so cool." And it kind of changed my whole perspective of this kid. I'm like, and of Star Trek in general. Like, I wasn't the only kid that liked Star Trek. There were other kids that liked Star Trek too. So I just thought that was really, really cool. And I just remember that. So anyways, I'm actually wanting to read a bit of this book to you guys, because I think what I'm about to read to you will tell you why I love this book so much. And again, it's called The Galactic Whirlpool. It's not that long that I'm going to read it, but this is the first Star Trek book, or one of the first Star Trek books that come out. And this opening sequence of chapter 1 is so iconic. It sums up everything about Star Trek. Now, if I can just turn the page and actually get to it, that would be amazing. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1. So just listen to this for a second. Space, the final frontier, a void as empty as death. 1,000,000,000 times 1,000,000,000 stars gleam like motes off sorrow, whirling to the stately gravity of time, like distant particles of dust caught and illuminated by silver moonbeams. They are tiny beacons, each one a home for hope, no longer quite as distant or unreachable, no longer quite so infinite. The mind cannot comprehend the vastness, the emptiness, the silence. Here, even the dust of space is measured in the number of atoms per cubic kilometer. And in this emptiness, something moves. A tiny metal speck, almost insignificant, so alone, so far from home, so far away from anything. From a closer perspective, the speck is a mighty vessel, a ship of metal and dreams, surrounded by stars too far in emptiness too deep. And inside, 430 souls share a dream, to go boldly, to go where no man has gone before, to seek out new life, new worlds. So much of the universe is unknown, so much of it is beyond the knowing, and yet humanity goes forth. Humanity searches. The United Starship Enterprise, NCC 1701, she is the pride of Starfleet, the pride of humanity. Okay, I just love that intro. I think it's incredible. And that begins the first Star Trek book ever made. This is why this is still my favorite Star Trek book 40 years later. Okay, so that is my my quick thing on Star Trek, and hopefully you guys can check those out. So again, Star Trek the Motion Picture, the definitive version is the theatrical, and it is this book. It's clearly this book based on what's in this, because Gene Roddenberry wrote the movie, wrote the book, and this is verbatim the theatrical version. Okay, so next I'm going to discuss Star Wars. And the book that I love, this is going to surprise you too. Yeah, right. The Last Jedi adaptation by Jason Fry. I love this book. And I think it's one of the best adaptations I've ever read for a movie. Sorry, I just need to get a bit of water here. And I'm just going to read a little bit of this to you as well, because I think it's relevant. And it's got this really interesting introduction. So, in the introduction, I'll just quickly tell you, I'm not going to read the whole thing. But in the introduction, we're given a scenario where Luke so back when Luke was 21 and on Tatooine, and the droids arrived, and he had to hide them and go see Ben Kenobi and so forth. In the introduction to this book, we're given a scenario where Luke actually turned the droids into the Empire. And what ends up happening is they come and get collected, and Luke never joins the rebellion. He never blows up the Death Star. And basically the Death Star destroys Yavin and the Rebel Alliance. And then what ends up happening is Luke grows up in a galaxy where the Empire is supreme. But Luke, here, let me just find something here. Luke ends up getting married with a family, and he ends up having a reputation for being able to predict the crops for his water, farming and stuff. And he gets kind of this reputation as being this really good businessman. But of course what's going on there, if we read between the lines, is Luke is tapping into the Force. He's a Jedi, but he doesn't know he's a Jedi. Hold on. Let me just take a look here. Yeah, I don't think I need to go into that further. But that's basically it. So it gives us a different future, or a different past that Luke had. And like I said, the Empire ends up that's it. Okay, so that's The Last Jedi, which I find to be just an amazing book. Okay, so now next here, I'm going to go over one of my favorite books of all time. Actually, it is my favorite book of all time, and that is Dracula by Bram Stoker. So I love this book so much. I read this book first when I was a teenager, and I've read it now probably 7 times. And I love this book so much, my wife bought me a handmade version of it. There's somebody in Alberta that has his own printing press, and he actually recreates books. So this is super cool. Like it's recreated. It's handmade. Like it's hand put together. And I just love this book. So I'm going to read two little bits of this that never get commented on. Like there's so many movie versions of this story, and none of them touch this. But they should, because to me it's such a important thematic element of sorry, I just gotta find it. Thematic element of the story. So one quick sec. Okay, so here we go. So something that always gets missed in all the adaptions of this is, so there's a group of people that come together that are the hawkers and obviously Van Helsing and so forth to hunt Dracula and vampires. And they see themselves as Christian crusaders out to defeat the ultimate evil. So I'll just read this to you quickly. The professor, they're referring to Van Helsing, said, I may, I suppose, take it that we are all acquainted with the facts that are in these papers. We all express assent. And he went on. Then it were, I think, good that I tell you something of the kind of enemy for which we are facing and dealing with. There are such beings as vampires. Some of us have evidence that they exist, even had we not the proof of our own unhappy experiences. The teachings and the records of the past give proof enough for sane people, okay? And this is the part that I find so interesting. So this is from Mina talking. She says, when God sees right to lift the burden that is hard upon us, till then we bear our cross, as his son did in obedience to his will. It may be that we are chosen instruments of his good pleasure, and that we ascend to his biding, as that others through stripes and shame, through tears and blood, through doubts and fear, and all that makes the difference between God and man. There was hope in his words and comfort, and they made for resignation. Mina and I both felt, so this is Jonathan talking, and simultaneously we each took one of the old man's hand and bent over and kissed it. Then without a word, we all knelt down together, all holding hands, swore to be true to each other. We men pledged ourselves to raise the veil of sorrow from the head of our womb. Each in our own way we loved, and we prayed for help and guidance in the terrible task which lay before us. It was then time to start. So basically, they see themselves as Christian soldiers fighting the ultimate evil. That always gets left out of all the film versions. I don't know why, because it should be in there, and it's in this. Okay. So the next one, the next book. First off, when I was a kid, there were a few great sci-fi authors. One of them was H.G. Wells and then Jules Verne. And one of them was also Edgar Rice Burroughs. And one of his great books was The Princess of Mars. I'm not going to review that today. But when I was a kid, at about the time of that original Star Trek book, I read this book, which is Tarzan at the Center of the Earth. I just love this book. And anyways, one of the things that's interesting about this that I'll quickly read to you, because it's become popular again with the new King Kong and Godzilla movies, they go to something called Hollow Earth, which is basically a world within our world. And this is all about Tarzan's expedition into that world. And back then in 1850, when this book was written, Edgar Rice Burroughs called it Pellucidar. As every schoolboy knows, in a world within a world, lying as it does upon the inner surface of the hollow sphere, there is the earth. It was discovered by David Innes and Abner Perry upon prospecting investigations. Anyways, I'm not going to go into this too much, other than to say I found it interesting that literally 150 years later, they brought that idea back and became Godzilla versus Kong. I love that. So that's this book, okay? Let me just keep going here. Okay, so that's Dracula. So I had written down for Dracula, Christian soldiers in fight against ultimate evil, crusade their duty They all take an oath to each other. Okay, now my next book that I want to cover, which has been one of my favorite books my entire life. As a child, I was introduced to Sherlock Holmes, and I began reading Sherlock Holmes when I was about 12. And Sherlock Holmes, of course, was written... Sorry, I just need some water. Sherlock Holmes was written by Sir Arthur Conan Doyle and began in 1902. And it's detective fiction, obviously. So my favorite Sherlock Holmes book is The Hound of the Baskerville. What I love about it is the atmosphere of the moors, the tension, London, where there's an assassination attempt on the client. In this book, there is Holmes' unrelenting disbelief in the supernatural. No matter what apparent evidence is presented to him or what others believe, he doesn't believe it. There's also a Canadian connection. Baskerville is from Canada. Has him arriving in London. Realization of the fog-covered Dartmoor and its residents. Baskerville Castle. The supernatural glowing hound. Strong narrative. Really a scam to gain the Baskerville fortune. And how Holmes unravels it. Well done. Okay, the next book I want to cover is A Christmas Carol, which is really a short story that came out in 1843 by Charles Dickens, and I'd class it as literature. Atmosphere, London, Christmas Eve, Old Miser, Three Ghosts, Marley, strange redemption, life affirming. And I've already gone over this before. I love that book. Dickens is credited with saving Christmas. At the time that this book came out, Christmas was both a religious and a festive combination. And there was a kind of a fight between those two sides on whether Christmas should be celebrated in a church or whether it should be celebrated at home, okay? There's nothing more Christian than Christmas. And there's nothing more Christmas than Dickens. It's the greatest Christmas book in history, other than the Bible. It's the most influential, completely changed London society's perspective of what Christmas was and what it could be, brought the two sides together, unified them. Okay? My next book is a book I just love. It's an American book, but it's a colonial book. And it's called The Legend of Sleepy Hollow by Washington Irving. Came out in 1820. I would class it as Gothic fiction. Not what you think. Such great prose. Descriptions of the Dutch Tarrytown setting and countryside. Ichabod love triangle. Headless Horseman barely is mentioned until the very end. And it's ambiguous. Did he actually exist? Did he actually get Ichabod? Perfect fall story. I've read this story in the fall, probably only a couple of times through my life, but I just love it. It's only 60 pages long. It's short like A Christmas Carol, but it's just such a great Halloween story. So like a great story for the holidays, okay? So the next one that I want to cover, which I just love, I've always loved Agatha Christie, and Murder on the Orient Express was written in 1934. It's a detective story. It's great. Love all the side characters, the setting of the Orient Express, being stuck in the snow in the mountains. Okay, the next book is one of my favorite books of all time that I read as a 12-year-old child. Still love it. It's The Phantom of the Opera by Gaston Luu, 1909, Gothic fiction. Eric is the main character, and then Christine is the singer. It takes place in the Paris Phantom or Opera House. It's this huge opera house with this giant underground cavern where the Phantom basically hides. And there's this whole beginning chapter of, does the Phantom even exist, or is he a ghost? So there's this whole supernatural element within it. It's just so well done. And the story is slowly revealed. Anyways, great story. Okay. That is it. Those are my favorite books of all time. And I'm hoping that my kids, or you or whatever, but I'm hoping that my kids just like this to me is a legacy video where I want to get this across for obvious reasons, because I want my kids to watch it. I think that is it for this story. So just to end off here, today, isn't the president of Ukraine, Julie? President, right? Mm-hmm. President.
Yeah.
So today the president of Ukraine is in North America, and he addressed the Parliament of Canada about the war going on. So I just wanted to do a quick, I don't know, shout out or whatever, or a quick God bless to him and what's going on right now. And that is it for this episode. So Trekkie Dave signing off.
I should like to have seen a bit more of Canada before we sailed, Hound. So should I, Watson. Canada. The linchpin of the English-speaking world, whose relations of friendly intimacy with the United States on the one hand, and their unswerving fidelity to the British Commonwealth and the motherland on the other. Canada. The link that joins together these great branches of the human family.
Churchill say that?
Yes, Watson, Churchill.